Welcome everybody to Memoirs Found in a Bathtub by Stanislaw Lem. It's not a terribly long book, but I'm a big fan of it. I'm excited to read it. Content warnings for a little bit of references to suicide throughout this book. Um, it's a espionage book, so there's talk about spies, breaking the capsule hidden in their teeth or whatever. So not super heavy stuff, but it is in there. And there's some more content warnings towards the end of the book that we'll talk about when we get closer to them. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Introduction. Oh, hi, hey, you're just in time. I'm starting the introduction now. Introduction. Notes from the Neogene is unquestionably one of the most precious relics of Earth's ancient past, dating from the very close of the pre-chaotic, that period of decline which directly preceded the Great Collapse. It's indeed a paradox that we know much more of the civilizations of the early Neogene, the proto-cultures of Assyria, Egypt, and Greece, than we do of the days of paleoatomics and rudimentary astrogation. While those archaic cultures left behind permanent monuments in bone, stone, slate, and bronze, almost the only means of recording and preserving knowledge during the Middle and Late Neogene was a substance called papier. Papier was whitish, flaccid, derivative of cellulose, rolled out on cylinders and cut into rectangular sheets. Information of all kinds was impressed on it with a dark tint, after which the sheets were collated and sewn in a special way. In order to understand what brought about the Great Collapse, the catastrophic event, which in a matter of weeks totally demolished the cultural achievement of centuries, we must go back 3,000 years. Metamnestics and data crystallization did not exist in these days. Papier performed all the functions now served by our mnemonitrons and nostors. True, there were the beginnings of artificial memory, but those were large, bulky machines, troublesome to operate and maintain, and used only in the most limited, narrow way. They were called electronic brains, an exaggeration comprehensible only in the historical perspective, much like the boast of the builders of Asia Minor that their sacred temple Babel was sky-reaching. No one knows exactly when and where the papieralysis epidemic broke out. Most likely it happened in the desert regions of a land called America, where the first spaceport was built. The people of that time did not immediately realize the scope of the impending danger. And yet, we cannot accept the harsh judgment delivered by so many subsequent historians, that these were a frivolous people. To be sure, papier was not distinguished by its durability, but one should not hold a pre-chaotic civilization responsible for failing to foresee the existence of the RV catalyst, also known as the Harshan agent. The true properties of this agent, after all, were discovered only in the Galactic period by one Pro-Doctor 6 Fulces, who established RV's origin as the third moon of Uranus. Unwittingly brought back to Earth by an early expedition, the 8th Melaldic, according to Prognoster Favak, the Harshan agent set off a chain reaction and papier disintegrated around the globe. The details of the cataclysm are not known. According to verbal reports crystallized only in the Fourth Galactium, the focal points of the epidemic were enormous data storage centers called libraries. The reaction was practically instantaneous. In place of those great treasuries, those reservoirs of society's memory, lay mounds of gray, powdery ash. The pre-chaotic scientists thought they were dealing with some paperophagous microbe and wasted valuable time in an attempt to isolate it. One can hardly deny the justice of Histronostor IV Taridis' bitter remark that humanity would have been better served had that time been spent engraving the disintegrating words into stone. Gravitronics, cybereconomics, and synthophysics were all unknown in the late Neogene when the catastrophe occurred. The economic systems of various ethnic groups called nations were relatively autonomous and wholly depended upon the circulation of papier, as was the flow of supplies to the Syrtic Tiberius colony on Mars. Papieralysis ruined a great deal more than the economy. That entire period is rightly named the era of paperocracy, for not only did the papier regulate and coordinate all group activities, but it determined in some obscure way the fate of individuals. For example, the identity papiers. The functional and ritual roles of papier in the folklore of that time, the catastrophe took place when the pre-chaotic Neogene was at its height, have not yet to be fully catalogued. While we do know the meaning of some expressions, others remain empty phrases, checks, documents, receipts, etc. In that era, one could not be born, grow up, obtain an education, work, travel, marry, or die, except through the aid and mediation of papier. Only in the light of these facts can one appreciate the full extent of the disaster which struck Earth. The quarantine of whole cities and continents, the construction of hermetically sealed shelters, all such measures failed. The science of the day was helpless against the catalyst's subatomic structure, the product of a most unusual antibiotic evolution. For the first time in history, society was threatened with total dissolution. To quote an inscription carved upon the wall of a urinal in the Frisco excavations by an anonymous bard of the Cataclysm, "And the heavens above the cities grew dark with clouds of blighted paper, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights a dirty rain, and thus with wind and streams of mud was the tail of man washed from the face of the earth forever." Must have been a cruel blow indeed to the pride of the late Neogene man, who saw himself already reaching the stars. The paperalysis nightmare pervaded all walks of life. Panic hit the cities. People, deprived of their identity, lost their reason. The supply of goods broke down. There were incidents of violence. Technology, research and development, schools all crumbled into non-existence. Power plants could not be repaired for lack of blueprints. The lights went out, and the ensuing darkness was illuminated only by the glow of bonfires. And so the Neogene entered into the chaotic, which was to last over 200 years. Obviously, the first quarter century of the Great Collapse left no written records. We can only guess under what conditions government was maintained and anarchy avoided until the establishment around mid-century of the Earth Federation. The more complex a civilization, the more vital to its existence is the maintenance of the flow of information. Hence, the more vulnerable it becomes to any disturbance in that flow. Now that flow, the lifeblood of society, had come to a halt. The last storehouse of information lay in the minds of living experts. To record and preserve that information had priority over all else. But this seemingly simple problem proved insoluble. In the late Neogene, knowledge was so compartmentalized that no one specialist could possibly assimilate the entirety of his field. Reconstruction consequently demanded tedious, long-term collaboration of different groups of experts. Had the task been undertaken at once, so Polynostor La Bar 8 of our Burman Historical School tells us, Neogene civilization could have been speedily restored. In answer to the distinguished founder of Neogene chronologistics, we must point out that the activity he postulates could indeed have led to the accumulation of veritable mountains of knowledge. But who would there have been to derive benefit from this? Certainly not the hordes of nomads who left their devastated cities, nor their children who grew up wild and illiterate. No, civilization could have been saved only at the very moment when industry began to fall apart, construction ceased, and transportation ground to a halt, when the starving masses of whole continents first cried out for help, including the colony on Mars, deprived of supplies and threatened with extinction. Clearly, the experts could not shut themselves up in ivory towers and take the time to develop new technologies of transcription. Desperate measures were employed. Certain branches of the amusement industry, such as films, mobilized their entire production to record incoming information on the positions of spaceships and satellites, for collisions were multiplying rapidly. Circuit diagrams were printed from memory on fabrics. All available plastic writing materials were distributed among the schools. Physics professors personally had to tend atomic piles. Emergency teams of scientists flitted from one point of the globe to another. But these were merely the tiny particles of order, atoms of organization that were quickly dissolved in an ocean of spreading chaos. Shaken as it was by endless upheavals, engaged in a constant struggle against the tide of superstition, illiteracy, and ignorance, the stagnant culture of the chaotic should be judged not by what it lost of the heritage of centuries, but by what it was able to salvage against all odds. To check the first fury of the Great Collapse necessitated tremendous sacrifices. Earth's first footholds on Mars had been saved, and technology, that backbone of all civilization, was reconstructed. Microphones and tape banks replaced the storage centers of demolished papier. Unfortunately, cruel losses were sustained in other areas. Because the supply of new writing materials failed to meet even the most urgent needs, anything that did not directly serve to save the bare framework of society had to be jettisoned. The humanities suffered the worst. Knowledge was disseminated orally, through lectures. The audiences became the educators of the next generation. This was one of those astonishing primitivisms of chaotic civilization that rescued Earth from total disaster, though losses in the areas of history, historiography, paleology, and paleoaesthetics were quite irreparable. Only the smallest fragment of a rich literary legacy was preserved. Millions of volumes of chronicles, priceless relics of Middle and Late Neogene, turned to dust forever. At the end of the chaotic, we find a most paradoxical situation. There was a relatively high level of technology, including the active initiation of gravitronics and technobotics, not to mention the success of cisgalactic mass transport. Yet the human race knew next to nothing of its own past. All that survives today of the enormous achievements of the Neogene are a few scattered, mostly unrelated remnants. Factual accounts altered beyond all recognition and thoroughly garbled through countless retellings in the oral tradition. Even the most important events are of doubtful chronology. One must concur with Subnoster Naprolays when he says that paperalysis meant historioparalysis. Only as this perspective can we assess the true value of the work of Prognoster Widwis, who, in his single-handed battle against official historiography, discovered the notes from the Neogene, a voice speaking to us across the abyss of centuries, a voice belonging to one of the last inhabitants of the lost land of America. This monument is all the more precious in that there are no others to rival it in importance. It cannot be compared, for example, with the paperantic finds made by the archaeological expedition of Sirtic Paleonostor Bradra the Memnite at the Marglo Shale diggings in the lower pre-Neogene. These finds concern religious beliefs prevalent during the 8th dynasty of America. They speak of various perils, black, red, yellow, evidently cannibalistic incantations connected in some way with the mysterious deity Race, to whom burnt offerings were apparently made. But this interpretation is still being debated by the transcendental and greater Sirtic schools, as well as by a group of disciples of the famous Bhagwad. Most of the Neogene, we fear, will forever remain shrouded in mystery, for even chronotraction methods have failed to provide the most fundamental details of social life at that age. Any systematic presentation of those few moments of history which we have been able to recreate goes well beyond the limits of this introduction. So we will limit ourselves to a few remarks in the way of the background to the notes. The evolution of ancient beliefs underwent a curious bifurcation. In the first period, the Archaeocredonic, various religions were founded upon the recognition of a supernatural, non-material principle, causative with respect to everything in existence. The Archaeocredonic left behind permanent monuments, the pyramids of the early Neogene, the excavations of the Mesogene, the Gothic cathedrals of La France. In this second period, the Neocredonic, faith assumed a different aspect. The metaphysical principle somehow merged with the materialistic, the earthly. Worship of the deity Capetal, or in the Cremonic palimpsests, Capta, became one of the dominant cults of the time. This deity was revered throughout America, and the faith quickly spread to Australia and parts of the European peninsula. Any connection, however, between the cult of Cap-Etal and the graven images of the elephant and the ass found here and there throughout America does seem somewhat doubtful. It was forbidden to utter the name itself, Cap-Etal, analogous to the Hebrew interdiction. In America, the deity was generally called Almighty Dalar. But there were many other liturgical names, and special monastic orders devoted themselves entirely to an appraisal of their changing status. Indeed, the fluctuation in the accepted value of each of the many names, or perhaps they were attributes, of Cap-Etal remains an enigma to this day. The difficulty in understanding the true nature of that last of the pre-chaotic religions lies in the fact that Cap-Etal was denied any supernatural existence, was therefore not a spirit, nor was he even considered a being, which will help explain the totemistic features of that cult, so unusual in an age of science. He was, to all extents and purposes, equated with assets, liquid, fixed, and hidden, and had no existence beyond that. However, it's been shown that in times of economic decline, sacrifices of sugar cane, coffee, and grain were made to placate the angry god. This contradiction was deepened by the fact that the cult of Capital did possess some elements of the doctrine of incarnation, according to which the world owed its continued existence to sacred property. Any violation of that doctrine met with the most severe punishment. See, if they didn't blow up the Georgia Guidestones, we would be reading a different history. You're absolutely right. 100%. As we know, the epoch of global cybernomics was preceded at the close of the Neogene by the rise of sociostasy. As the cult of Capital, mired in complex corporational rites and intricate institutional rituals, began in the course of time to lose one territory after another to the followers of secular sociostatic management, there arose a conflict between the lands still ruled by that antiquated faith and the remaining world. Up to the very end, that is, to the formation of the Earth Federation, the center of the most fanatic devotion to Capital was America, a land governed by a series of dynasties called Presidents. These were not high priests of Capital in the strict sense of the word. It was during the 19th dynasty that the Presidents, or Presidents in the nomenclature of the Theric school, built the Pentagon. What was it, the first of many granite leviathans, that first of many granite leviathans, that stern edifice which ushered in the twilight of the Neogene? Prehistorians of the Aquilian school considered the Pentagon's tombs for presidents, analogous to the Egyptian pyramids. This hypothesis was discovered in the light of subsequent discoveries, as was the theory that these were shrines to Capital, where crusades were planned against the heathen dog, or strategies devised to ensure his successful conversion. Lacking the first-hand information needed to solve this puzzle, undoubtedly the key to an understanding of the whole final phase, the 24th and 25th dynasties, our historians turned to the Temporal Institute for help. The Institute's full cooperation made possible the application of the latest technological developments in chronotraction to the task of penetrating the riddle of the pentagons. We sent 290 probes into the far past, tapping 17 trillion erg-seconds from the time wells that orbit the moon. According to the theory of chronotraction, movement back in time is practicable only at a considerable distance from objects of great mass, since their proximity consumes staggering amounts of energy. Internet's having a die. I've been doing this all day. Well, we can take a break for a few minutes if you need to get back in. Okay, all right. According to the theory of chronotraction, movement back in time is practicable only at a considerable distance from objects of great mass, since their proximity consumes staggering amounts of energy. Consequently, sightings of the past had to be taken from probes placed high in the stratosphere. Their sudden appearance and disappearance in the sky must have mystified the people of the Neogene. Pro-Dr. Tu Sturlprins maintains that the projection of a retrochronal probe would show up in the past as a bulging disk, not unlike two horizontal saucers, floating rim to rim throughout space. Chronotraction yielded an abundance of data, including authentic photoshots of the first Pentagon soon after its construction. This building, indeed a Pentagon, each side measuring 460 feens, was a veritable labyrinth of steel and concrete. Histo Nostor Ser N estimates the corridors ran about 17 to 18 of their mills. The entrances were guarded day and night by over 200 priests of lower rank. Further time delving, prompted by the chronicles excavated in the ruins of Washtin, led to the discovery of the second Pentagon, a much less imposing structure than the first, as most of it lay beneath the ground. Certain passages from the chronicles pointed to the existence of yet another, a third Pentagon. This was to have been a closed, completely independent unit, a state within a state, by virtue of sophisticated camouflaging and enormous reserves of food, water, and compressed air. However, after systematic chronoaxial surroundings were taken over the entire length and breadth of 20th century America, and revealed not a trace of any such structure, most historians accepted the thesis that the Washtun Chronicles spoke of the third Pentagon in a figurative sense only, that the building was raised purely in the minds and hearts of the faithful, and that the propagation of the legend was designed to uplift the flagging spirits of those few remaining followers of Cape Tal. So stood the official version of our historiography when the young prognoster Windwis began his archaeological career. Windwis re-examined all the available materials and published a treatise in which he maintained that as the power of the Pres Tens began to wane and their dominions diminished, they resolved to build a new seat of government, one far from all populated areas, somewhere in the mountainous regions of Amarka, and hidden deep beneath the rocks. This last refuge of Cape Tal might be inaccessible to the uninitiated. Windwis held that the postulated Pentagon of the last dynasty was a kind of collective military brain whose task was twofold. First, to watch over and preserve the purity of the faith, and secondly, to convert those peoples of the world who had abandoned the true path. But Windwis's treatise was pooh-poohed by the experts. It clearly ran counter to most of the known facts. Sorry, my eye is really bugging me. Critics like Supernosters Jonavak, Quiristo, and Pisovo of the Martian School of Comparative Paleography pointed out the many contradictions in Windwis's chronology. For example, the last Pentagon had been built, according to Windwis, only a few decades before the Pepir catastrophe. But if this third Pentagon had really existed, argued the critics, the Pres Tens within would have surely taken advantage of the post-Pepir anarchy and attempted to conquer the world in the very first days of the chaotic. And even had such an attempt to overthrow the Federation been thwarted, some trace of it would have survived in the oral tradition. Yet our historiography notes nothing of the kind. Windwis defended his hypothesis, claiming that when the populace of Amarka went over to the side of the heretics and joined the Federation, the priests of the last Pentagon ordered it to be completely sealed off from the outside world. So the underground Malak isolated itself from the rest of humanity and endured to the chaotic, without the least knowledge of what was taking place on the surface of the earth. This absolute hermetic isolation of a community of priests and warriors of Cape Tal did seem, Windwis admitted, a bit unlikely. So he went on to speculate that the last Pentagon may have possessed scanning devices to the outside. He did not think, however, that the collective military brain of the last dynasty was capable of any offensive or even defensive action. It certainly could not have attacked or engineered a coup against the Federation, for once the Colossus had buried itself in rock and severed all ties with the future course of history, it was imprisoned not only by impenetrable walls, but by the very nature of its internal organization. From that time on, it thrived exclusively on the myth, the legend of the glory that was Cape Tal, and investigated, rooted out, and waged bitter war against heresy, the heresy within. Our histonosters answered these arguments with stony silence. But Windwis did not give in. For 27 years, with only a handful of loyal colleagues to help him, he combed the Rocket Mountains from end to end. And just when almost everyone had forgotten him, his stubbornness was dramatically vindicated. On 28 May 3146, the head archaeological team, having cleared away several hundred tons of rubble at the foot of Harvard Peak, stood before a convex shield, cleverly camouflaged, excellently preserved. This was the entrance to the last Pentagon. Stability achieved. Nice. Exploration of the underground building, however, proved extremely difficult and demanded extraordinary methods. In the 72nd year of its retreat from the world, the Pentagon of the last dynasty succumbed to a natural disaster. A slight shift in the mountain's granite core produced a fissure that traveled down through several strata until it came into contact with magma. The building's concrete protective shell could not withstand the volcanic pressure. Molten lava entered and filled the interior from top to bottom. And so, that strange anthill of the last of the Pres Tens became a giant fossil, and as such, waited 1,680 years to be discovered. It is not our task to describe here the tremendous archaeological wealth of the Third Pentagon diggings. We refer the interested reader to the many volumes devoted specially to that subject. Only a few remarks remain to be added to this introduction to the notes. The notes were discovered in the third year of excavation on the fourth level, within an intricate corridor system where there were several sanitation facilities. In one of these facilities, filled as the rest with igneous rock, were two human skeletons, and beneath them a scroll of papier. The notes. The reader will see for himself that the daring suppositions of Histonostor Widwis were for the most part quite accurate. The notes portray the fate of a community locked beneath the earth, a community that refused to allow the infiltration of any news of real events, pretending it constituted the brain, the headquarters of an empire that extended even to the most remote galaxies. In time, the pretense became belief, the belief a certainty. The reader will witness how the fanatical servants of Capital created the myth of the anti-building, how they spent their lives in mutual surveillance, in tests of loyalty and devotion to the mission, even when the last figment of that mission's reality had become an impossibility, and nothing remained but to sink ever deeper into the pit of collective madness. Our historiography has not yet passed final judgment on the notes, commonly called, for their location of their discovery, Memoirs found in a bathtub. Then, too, no agreement has been reached as to when and in what order certain parts of the manuscript were written. The Hiberia Nostors, for example, consider the first 12 pages apocryphal, an edition of later years, but the reader will hardly be interested in such technical matters. Let us then be silent and allow this last message from the Neogene, the era of paperocracy, to speak with us in its own voice. That's an exciting introduction. I'm going to run to the bathroom real quick, and then we'll get started with Chapter 1. All right. Let's do it. Memoirs found in a bathtub, Stanislaw Lem, Chapter 1. I couldn't seem to find the right room. None of them had the number designated on my pass. First I wound up at the Department of Verification, then the Department of Misinformation, then some clerk from the Pressure section advised me to try Level 8, but on Level 8 they ignored me, and later I got stuck in a crowd of military personnel. The corridors rang with their vigorous marching back and forth, the slamming of doors, the clicking of heels, and over that martial noise I could hear the distant music of bells, the tinkling of metals. Now and then, janitors would go by with steaming percolators. Now and then I would stumble into restrooms where secretaries hastily renewed their makeup. Now and then, agents disguised as elevator men would strike up conversations. One of them had an artificial leg, and he took me from floor to floor so many times that after a while he began waving to me from a distance, and he even stopped photographing me with the camera carnation in his lapel. By noon we were buddies, and he showed me his pride and joy, a tape recorder under the elevator floor. But I was getting more and more depressed, and I couldn't share his enthusiasm. Stubborn, I went from room to room and pestered people with questions, though the answers were invariably wrong. I was still on the outside, still excluded from that ceaseless flow of secrecy that kept the building strong. But I had to get in somewhere, find an entry at some point, no matter what. Twice I ended up in a storage cellar and leafed through some secret documents lying about, but there was nothing there of any value to me. After several hours of this, thoroughly annoyed and hungry as well, it was past lunchtime and there wasn't even a cafeteria to be found, I decided to take a different tack. I recalled that the highest concentration of tall gray officers was on the 4th level, and so I headed there, opened a door bearing the sign by appointment only, and entered an empty reception room. From there, I went through a side door marked "Knock Before Entering" and ran into a conference room full of moldering mobilization plans. Here I ran into a problem. There were two doors. One said "No admittance" and the other said "Closed." After some deliberation, I decided on the second door, the correct choice as it turned out, since this was the office of General Cashenblade himself, the Commander-in-Chief. I walked in, and the officer who was on duty at the time led me to the chief without asking any questions. A powerful, bald old man, Cashenblade stirred his coffee. His head was perched upon the collar of his uniform. The bristling, many-folded jowls covered the galactic insignia and stripes like a bib. The desk was cluttered with phones and surrounded by computer consoles, speakers, buttons, and in the center was a row of labeled glass jars. Specimens, apparently, though I couldn't see a thing in them apart from alcohol. Cashenblade, the veins bulging on his shiny pate, was busy pushing buttons to silence the phones as soon as they began to ring. When several rang together, he rammed his fist into the whole bank of buttons. Then he noticed me. In the silence that followed, there was only the grim tapping of his teaspoon. "So there you are," he snapped. It was a powerful voice. "Yes," I answered. "Wait, don't tell me. I have a good memory," he growled, watching me from under those bushy eyebrows. "X-27 Contrastellar to Cygnus Eps, right?" "No," I said. "No? No? Well then, more Ballantrix BKUK 81-Operation Nail? B as in bipropodal?" "Nope," I said, trying to maneuver my past before his eyes. He waved it aside impatiently. "No?" He looked hurt. Then he looked pensive. He stirred his coffee. The phone rang. His hand came down on the button like a lion's paw. "Plastic!" He shot at me. "Plastic?" I said. "Well, hardly. I'm just an ordinary..." Cashenblade stilled the rising din of phones with one quick slap and looked over once more. "Operation Cyclogastrosaur. Entomopentatia..." He kept trying, unwilling to admit to any gap in his infallibility. When I failed to respond, he suddenly leaned forward and roared, "Out!" And it really looked as if he himself were ready to throw me out bodily. But I was too determined, also too much a civilian, to obey that order. I held my ground and kept the pass under his nose. At last, Cashenblade reluctantly took it and, without even examining it, tossed it into the drawer of some machine, which immediately began to hum and whisper. Cashenblade listened to the machine. His face clouded over and his eyes glittered. He gave me a furtive glance and started pressing buttons. The phones rang out together like a brass band. He silenced them and pressed other buttons. Now the speakers drowned one another out with numbers and cryptonyms. He stood there and listened with a scowl, his eyelid twitching. But I could see the storm had passed. "All right, hand over your scrap of paper," he barked. "But I already did." "To whom?" "To you." "To me?" "To you, sir." "When? Where?" "Just a moment ago, you threw..." I began, and then bit my tongue. Cashenblade glared at me and opened the drawer of the machine. It was empty. My pass had disappeared. Not that I believed for a moment this was an accident. In fact, I had suspected for some time now that the Cosmic Command, obviously no longer able to supervise every assignment on an individual basis when there were literally trillions of matters in its charge, had switched over to a random system. The assumption would be that every document, circulating endlessly from desk to desk, must eventually hit upon the right one. A time-consuming procedure, perhaps, but one that would never fail. The universe itself operated on this same principle. And for an institution as everlasting as the universe, certainly our building was such an institution, the speed at which these meanderings and perturbations took place was of no consequence. At any rate, my pass was gone. Cashenblade slammed the drawer shut and observed me for a while, blinking. I stood there, my hands at my side, uncomfortably aware of their emptiness. His blinking became more insistent as I stood there, and then positively fierce. I blinked back. That seemed to pacify him. "Okay," he muttered, pushing a few buttons. Computers churned, multicolored shapes snaked out onto the desk. He tore them off bit by bit, read them, absent-mindedly set other machines going, machines that made copies and destroyed originals. Finally, a white folder emerged with Instructions B66 Papra label, in letters so large I could read them from across the desk. "Your assignment. A mission. A special mission," General Cashenblade said with tremendous gravity. "Deep penetration. Subversion." "Were you ever there?" he asked with a blink. "Where?" "There." He lifted his head. Once again the eyelids fluttered. I didn't know what to answer. "And this is an agent," he said with disgust. "An agent. A modern agent." He grew morose. The word agent was stretched out of shape and became a taunt. It whistled through his teeth. Every consonant and vowel was chewed and slowly tortured. Then he exploded. "Everything has to be spelled out, huh? Don't you read the papers? Stars, for example. Tell me about the stars. What do they do?" "Well, they shine," I said doubtfully. "They shine," he says. "All right, how? How do they shine? Tell me how." They twinkle, they blink, they wink," I answered in an involuntary whisper. How clever he is. At last, they wink. Yes, they wink. But when do they wink? Do you know when? I bet you don't. That's the kind of material I have to work with around here. At night. They wink. They cower under cover of night. He roared like a lion. I stood at attention, straight as an arrow, waiting for the storm to pass. But it was not passing. Cashenblade puffed up and purpled at the top of his bald head, shook the room with his bellow, shook the building itself. And the spiral nebulae? Well, don't tell me you don't know what that means. Spiral? In the expanding universe, the retreating galaxies. Where are they going? Where are they running from? And the Doppler shift to the red. Highly suspicious. No, more. A clear admission of guilt. He gave me a withering look, sat back, and said in a voice cold with contempt, "Moron." "Now, just a minute," I flared up. What? What was that? Just a minute? Ah, yes, the password. Good. Just a minute, the password. Yes, that's better. And he attacked the buttons. The machines rattled like rain on a tin roof. Green and gold ribbons spun out and coiled on the desk. The old man read them avidly. "Good," he concluded, clutching them in his fists. "Your mission. Conduct an on-the-spot investigation. Verify, search, destroy, incite, inform. Over and out. On the nth day, nth hour, Sector N, Subsector N, rendezvous with N. Stop. Salary group under cryptonym Bareback. Voucher for unlimited oxygen. Payment by weight for denunciations. And sporadic. Report regularly. Your contact is Pirate LAP. Your cover, Lyra PIP. When you fall in action, posthumous decoration with the Order of the Top Secret, full honors, salutes, memorial plaque, and a written recommendation in your dossier. Any questions?" But if I don't fall in action?" I asked. An indulgent smile spread across the general's face. "A wise guy," he said. I had to get a wise guy. Very funny. Okay, so much for the jokes. You have your mission now. Do you understand what that is? His lofty brow unwrinkled. The golden medals on his chest gleamed. A mission! Oh, it's a wonderful thing. And special. A special mission. Words fail me. Go, my boy. God be with you, and keep on your toes. I'll do my best, I said. But what exactly is the assignment? He pressed several buttons. Phones rang. He silenced them. The purple pate slowly turned to pink. He eyed me benevolently, like a father. "Oh," he said, "extremely hazardous. But remember, it's not for me. I am not sending you. The country, the common good. Yes, I know, it'll be hard, no picnic, a tough nut to crack. You'll see. Tough, but it must be done. Because... Our duty," I prompted. He beamed. He rose. The metals on his chest swayed and jingled like bells. A hush fell over the machines. The phones grew silent and the lights dimmed. He approached me, gave me his powerful, hairy hand, the hand of an old soldier. His eyes bored right through me, the bushy brows knitted in a solemn squint. Thus we stood, united by a handshake, the commander-in-chief and the secret agent. "Our duty," were his words. "Well said, my boy. Our duty. Take care." I saluted, about-faced, exited, hearing on the way out how he sipped his cold coffee. Cashenblade. Now there was a man. End of chapter 1. Lamp. Zach just showed me what the covers of this book look like. It's badass if you haven't checked it out, that old time surrealism. Yeah, it does look good. I have the one that basically describes the scene from the beginning. The bathtub with two skulls. I changed it to the I changed the icon of the Discord like reminder group to that, even though I don't even use it anymore. I mean, I literally just post I'm about to go live in it. That's the only... I don't even post that. I usually just post whatever GIF I found on my keyboard. Okay, alright. Focus. We'll go for a bit longer. I'm having fun. I was thinking we would stop around 11, but, you know, if we go a little longer, I'm cool with that. Chapter 2. Still a little dazed by my conversation with the chief, I entered the main office. The secretaries were all busy putting on lipstick and stirring coffee. A wad of papers tumbled out of the mail chute. My orders, signed by General Cashenblade. One clerk stamped them classified and handed them to another, who put them on index cards, which in turn were filed away, retrieved, coded by a machine. Then the key was destroyed, all the original papers burned, the ashes sifted, registered, and sealed in an envelope bearing my number, and the envelope was dispatched by pneumonic tube to an unknown vault. But I was unable to pay proper attention to this procedure. The unexpected turn of events had left me quite numb. General Cashenblade's cryptic remarks clearly indicated matters so secret that one could only hint at them, though sooner or later I would have to be apprised of their substance. How else could I accomplish my mission? Did the mission have anything to do with my original pass? But that question was utterly insignificant in the light of this new, all-too-sudden career of mine. My musings were interrupted by the arrival of a young officer, who introduced himself as the chief's undercover aide, Lieutenant Blanderdash. This Lieutenant Blanderdash shook my hand, told me he had been assigned to my person, led me to an office across the hall, offered me some coffee, began to extol my extraordinary abilities. They had to be extraordinary indeed, for Cashenblade to have given me such a tough nut to crack. And also marveled at the naturalness of my face, particularly the nose. Then I realized he assumed it was false. I stirred my coffee in silence, deciding that reticence was the best policy. After some 15 minutes, he took me through an officer's passageway to a service elevator. We broke the seal and wrote it down. Incidentally, he said as soon as we stepped out, do you yawn much? Not that I know of. Why? Oh, nothing. When a person yawns, one can look inside, you know. You don't snore by any chance? No. Wonderful. Can't imagine how many of our people have come to a bad end by snoring. What happened to them? I was reckless enough to ask. But he only smiled and fingered his insignia. Perhaps you'd like to see the displays? They're right on this level, over here by the columns. Our Department of Collections. Sure, I replied. But do we have the time? Oh, no problem, he said, steering me in the right direction. Anyway, this is not to satisfy an idle curiosity. In our profession, the more one knows, the better. Blanderdash opened an ordinary white door, behind which was solid steel. He worked a combination lock, and the steel slid away, revealing an enormous, windowless but brightly lit hall. The coffered ceiling was supported by pillars. The walls were covered with tapestries and hangings in black, gold, and silver. I'd never seen anything so magnificent before. Between the columns, across the highly polished parquet, stood the showcases, cabinets, vitrines, and slender metal legs. Chests with their lids open. The one nearest me was filled with small items that gleamed like jewels. They were cufflinks, and there must have been 1,000,000 of them. From another chest rose a mound of pearls. Blanderdash led me to the glass cases. On velvet cushions lay artificial ears, noses, bridges, fingernails, warts, eyelashes, boils, and humps, some displayed in cross-section to show the gears and springs inside. As I stepped back, I stumbled against the chest of pearls and shuddered. They were teeth. Snaggle teeth and tiny teeth, buck teeth, teeth with cavities and teeth without, milk teeth, eye teeth, wisdom teeth. My guide smiled and pointed to the nearest tapestry. I took a closer look. Beards, goatees, sideburns, mutton chops, all sewn onto a nylon base in such a fashion that the blonde ones represented, against a brunette background, the national seal. In the next room, even more spacious than the first, were more glass cases. These contained artifacts and keepsakes, such as cheeses or decks of cards. From the pine ceiling beams hung artificial limbs, corsets, clothing. There were artificial insects, too, crafted with a precision that only a great and wealthy power could have summoned the means to achieve. The insect display alone filled several shelves. Blanderdash did not intrude with explanations, certain that the corpora delicti assembled here would speak for themselves. But now and then, whenever he thought I might overlook some particularly interesting item in the abundance of things to see, he pointed it out discreetly. For example, he directed my attention to a great quantity of poppy seed placed on white silk under a strong magnifying lens. This enabled me to notice that each individual seed had been painstakingly hollowed out. Amazed, I turned to ask him what this meant, but he cut me off with a commiserating smile and a shrug, and to make his meaning clear, silently mouthed the word classified. Only when we left did he casually remark, "Interesting trophies, aren't they?" This is a character creator. Spare parts. The next room was even more magnificent. I looked up and saw an enormous tapestry on the opposite wall, a true masterpiece in auburn and black, depicting the birth of a nation. After some hesitation, Blenderdash pointed out one dignitary's coat in the panorama. The lapels were neatly trimmed black sideburns. I was given to understand that they originally belonged to an enemy agent this dignitary had unmasked. A cold draft from beyond the columns suggested a whole suite of rooms beyond. I no longer looked at the exhibits, but followed my guide meekly, quite lost in all this splendor, dazzled by the glitter in the spotlights. We went past sections on the opening of safes, the tempting of agents, the drilling through walls of mountains, the drying up of seas. I gaped at many stored machines, machines to copy mobilization plans at any distance, machines to change night into artificial day, and vice versa. We crossed a large hall under an immense crystal dome used to simulate sunspots and falsify planetary orbits. Replicas of fake constellations and imitation galaxies gleamed on plaques of precious stone. Behind the walls, powerful vacuum pumps worked to maintain the low density of air and high level of radiation required to keep the counterfeit atoms and electrons functioning smoothly. My head was spinning. There was too much to take in. Blenderdash noticed my condition and asked me to follow him to the exit. Earlier, halfway through the Department of Collections, I'd prepared some compliments to deliver after seeing the entire exhibit. But now I couldn't utter a single word. Blenderdash understood my silence and said nothing. At the elevator, 2 officers approached us, saluted, begged my pardon, and took Blenderdash aside. Blenderdash seemed surprised. He said something, eyebrows raised, but they answered with negative gestures, and pointed in my direction. With this, the brief exchange ended. Blenderdash left with the older officer, and the younger approached, and explained with an ingratiating smile that he was to accompany me to Department N. Blenderdash and Slardabart Fast work across from the office from each other and hate each other. It's just 2 Space Station 13 created characters. I saw no reason to protest, but as we stepped back into the elevator, I began to question him about my former guide. "Did you say something?" the officer asked, lowering his ear to my mouth and at the same time pressing his hand to his chest as if in pain. Yes, about Blenderdash. Why was he called away on duty? I know I shouldn't ask." Not at all, the officer said hastily. A slow, peculiar smile widened his thin lips. Could you say that again?" he asked, suddenly pensive. "Say what?" "The name." "Blenderdash? But that's his name, isn't it?" "Oh, I'm sure it is. But his smile grew more pensive. "Blenderdash," he muttered as the elevator came to a stop. "Blenderdash. Of course." I wondered what the "of course" was supposed to mean, whether or not it was for my benefit, but just then the elevator opened and we were walking quickly down a corridor toward one of those white doors. He ushered me into a long, narrow room without windows and snapped the door shut behind me. There were 4 desks under low lamps and an officer at each, laboring over stacks of paper and in shirt sleeves because of the heat. One of them sat up and fixed his dark eyes on me. "State your business." I subdued my impatience. "Special mission by order of General Cashenblade." If I thought the other officers would look up at these words, I was greatly mistaken. "Your name?" I was asked in the same brisk manner. The officer had the muscular hands of an athlete, tanned with a small tattoo and code. I gave my name. He pressed the keys of a machine on his desk. "The nature of the mission?" "I'm to be briefed on that here." "Oh?" he said. He took his jacket off the chair, put it on, buttoned it, adjusted the epaulets, and headed for a side door. "Follow me." I followed him, looking around and realizing for the first time that the officer who had brought me here never entered, but remained in the hall. My new guide turned a desk lamp on and introduced himself. Second Decoder Dasher Blar. Have a seat. He pressed a buzzer. The young secretary brought 2 cups of coffee. Dasher Blar sat opposite me and sipped his coffee without a word. You're to be briefed on the goal of your mission? He said at last. Yes. Your mission. It's difficult, complicated, unusual, too. I'm sorry, your name? Still the same, I said with a faint smile. The officer smiled in return. He had beautiful teeth. His whole face radiated sincerity and openness in that moment. Cigarette? No thanks, I don't smoke. Good, very good. It's a bad habit, a very bad habit. Well then, excuse me a moment. He got up, switched on the overhead lights, went to a huge metal safe, and turned 7 combination dials in succession. The massive steel plate slid noiselessly aside, and he began to look through a file of folders within. Now, your instructions, he said. But then a buzzer sounded. He turned and looked at me. Must be important. Could you wait? I'll take only a minute. Dasher Blar went out, shutting the door quietly, leaving me alone with the open safe. Was this a test? How could they be so obvious about it, so transparent? I was annoyed. For a while I didn't budge. Then I happened to turn my head toward the safe. Immediately I looked away. But there was a mirror, and it showed all the contents of the safe, all the secret documents. I thought of counting the wooden panels in the parquet floor, but the floor was linoleum. I inspected my knuckles. I was getting angry. Why shouldn't I look where I please? So I looked. The folders were black, green, pink. A few were yellow and had saucer-like seals hanging from strings. One folder in particular, the one on top, was dog-eared. That was probably it. Anyway, the chief of staff himself gave me the mission. If there was any trouble, I could always mention his name. But wait, what was I thinking of? I looked at my watch. 10 minutes had passed. Complete silence. My chair became more uncomfortable with each passing minute. I crossed my legs. That was worse. I got up, straightened the crease of my trousers, sat down again. Even the desk on which I rested my elbow irritated me. I stretched. It took a minute. My stomach began to growl. I drank the rest of my coffee and contemplated the sugar at the bottom of the cup. I no longer dared even look at the open safe. Another glance at my watch. An hour had gone by. By the second hour, I gave up all hope that the officer would return. Something must have happened. But what? Was he suddenly recalled like Blanderdash? Or was it Dasher Bland? No, Dashenblard. Dashenblade? For the life of me, I couldn't remember. My stomach growled too much. I got up and paced the floor. Almost 3 hours now, alone with an open safe full of secret documents. Heads would roll, including my own. Oh, he fixed me all right, that whatever his name was. Suppose someone asked me who I was waiting for. I decided to leave. But which way? The way I came in? They would question me and my story wouldn't hold up. I could feel that. The judges would smile. You mean to tell us that an officer whose name you can't even remember left you alone with an open safe? Come now, let's think up something a little more original. It was hot. Sweat streamed down my neck and back. My throat was dry. I tried to close the safe, but the bolts wouldn't lock. No matter how much I turned the dials, the door stubbornly sprang back. It refused to stay shut. Then there were footsteps in the hall. I jumped back, caught my sleeve on the file, and the whole stack of folders tumbled out onto the floor. The doorknob moved. I lost my head. I crawled under the desk. All I could see of the man who entered were black, pointed shoes. For a moment he stood still. Then he quietly closed the door and tiptoed over to the safe, out of my field of vision. I heard the rustle of paper, and then another sound, a faint clicking, like a distant bell. Of course! He was photographing the secret documents. That meant this wasn't the other officer, but... I crept out from under the desk and crawled towards the door. Then, as I reached it, I sprang up and leaped out into the hall. In the split second it took me to slam the door, I caught a glimpse of a pale, horrified face and a camera falling from trembling hands. Then I was far away. I walked straight ahead, keeping an even step, past various bends and curves in the hall, rows of white doors through which I could hear the muffled noise of office work, and a faint bell-like tinkling, a sound that was no longer a mystery to me. Now what? Report the whole incident? But obviously that man would no longer be there. All that would remain was an open safe and papers strewn about the room. Suddenly I froze. I left my name in the office there. They knew me. They were searching for me. The whole building must have been altered by now. All staircases, exits, elevators were being watched. I looked around. The corridors were filled with the usual activity. Several officers were carrying folders as like the ones in the safe as peas in a pod. A janitor went by with a steaming percolator. An elevator opened right in front of me, and two adjutants stepped out. They didn't even see me. Why wasn't anything happening? Why wasn't I being hunted down? Could it be that all of this was only a test? I made a quick decision. The nearest door read 76 over 941. No, I didn't like it. I moved on. 76 over 950 suited me. Knock? What for? As I entered, two secretaries were stirring their coffee, and a third arranged sandwiches on a plate. They ignored me. I passed them and tried another door, the next room. I walked in. So, you finally got here. Come in, make yourself comfortable. A tiny old man in gold spectacles smiled at me from behind the desk. His hair was white as milk, and so sparse that pink skin innocently peeked out here and there. The eyes were like small nuts, the smile was cordial, the gestures full of welcome. I sank into a soft armchair. General Cashenblade, I began, but he didn't let me finish. Of course. Will you allow me? His palsied fingers pressed a few buttons. Then he rose with great ceremony, a grave smile on his face. The lower lid of his left eye had a slight twitch. Under eavesdropper Blassencash. Permit me to shake your hand. You know me? And how could I not know you? Oh, really? I stammered, completely thrown off balance. Then perhaps you have my instructions? Why, certainly. But there's no hurry. So many years of isolation. The Zodiac. How the thought saddens my heart at such great distances, you know. A man finds it hard to believe, to reconcile himself with the fact, don't you think? I'm an old man, I talk too much. You know, I never flew, not once. Well, that's our work. Always behind a desk. Sleevelets, you know, to protect the cuffs. I wore out 18 pair. He shook his head. So you see, that's how it is. An old man rambles on. He conducted me to an enormous room, all in green and large enough to be a banquet hall. The floor glistened like a lake. On the far side stood a green table and chairs. Our footsteps echoed as if we were in a cathedral. The old man tottered along at my side, smiling, adjusting the spectacles that kept slipping down his nose. At the table, he pulled out a chair for me, beautifully upholstered, and with an elegant crest on the back. He sat in another, stirred his coffee with a withered hand, took a sip, and whispered, "Cold." I waited. He leaned over confidently. Surprised? Well, not really, no. You can tell me I'm an old man, but I don't insist. That would be on my part, of course, but then you see the utter loneliness and the gates of mystery opening, inviting the dark abyss. Temptation. It's only human, understandable. And what is curiosity? The first reflex of a newborn baby, the most natural of impulses, the primal wish to find the cause of the effect that in turn causes action. And so a continuity is established. The chains that bind us. And it all began so innocently. Excuse me, I asked, confused. What are you getting at? Just this, he shouted in a thin, piping voice. Just this. He leaned closer, the gold frames of his spectacles gleaming. Here we have the cause, there the effect. What am I getting at, you ask? The mind cannot leave such questions unanswered. It fills in the gaps, takes a little here, adds a little there. Look, I said, I really don't understand what all this... In a minute, young man. Not all is darkness. I shall explain the best I can. Oh, forgive a poor old man who does his best. What did you want to know? My instructions. Your what? He was clearly surprised. I said nothing. He closed his eyes. His wrinkled lips moved as if he were counting. 16, take away 1, carry the 6. He grinned. Perfect. Your instructions, your papers, your documents, your blueprints, war plans, strategic calculations, everything's secret, top secret. Oh, what the enemy wouldn't give. Despicable, conniving, wanting to take over, if only for one night, 1 hour. The old man almost sang the words, and so he sends out his agents, well briefed, well schooled, well disguised, and they sneak in, destroy, steal, copy, and their name is Legion, he cried in a quavering voice, clutching his spectacles with both hands. And what can we do? In 100,000 cases, we unmask the conspiracy, cut off the evil hand, extract the deadly poison. But the attempts are renewed, 2 arms grow where one was severed, and the end result is the same, inevitable. What one can hide, another can find. The natural course of events, young man. He ran out of breath and gave me a piteous smile. I waited. But just imagine, what if there were more than one plan? Not 2, not 4, 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000. Could they steal that? Yes, they could, but then the first plan would contradict the seventh, and the seventh would contradict the 981st, and the 981st would contradict all the others. Each one says something else. No two are alike. Which is the right one? The real one. The one and only one. Clever, I said. Yes! His cry of triumph ended in a fit of coughing, a fit so violent that his spectacles flew off. He caught them in midair. I could have sworn a piece of the nose had also come off. No, it must have been my imagination. The poor old man was blue in the face. His wrinkled lips trembled. Now, imagine thousands of safes, thousands of original documents, everywhere, on every level of the building, all under lock and key. Each one an original, each one entirely unique, millions and millions of them, and each one is different. Wait a minute, I said. Are you trying to tell me that instead of only one operational plan, there are... Exactly. Your grasp of the situation is perfect, young man. But there must be at least one correct plan. I mean, if we ever had to, if the necessity arose. I didn't finish, struck by the change that had come over him. He was looking at me as if I'd suddenly turned into a monster. Is that what you think? He rasped, his eyelids fluttering like dried-up butterflies. Well, not really, I replied cautiously. Let's suppose that everything is as you say. How does it all affect me? And if I may ask, what connection does it have with the mission? Mission? His smile, humble and hesitant, was altogether too sweet. The special mission assigned to me by... But I told you that at the very beginning, didn't I? Our Commander-in-Chief, General Cashenblade. Cashenblade? Surely you know the name of your own chief. Excuse me, he whispered after a long silence. Would you mind if I leave for a moment? I won't be long. I'm sorry, I said, politely but firmly holding his arm when he attempted to get up. You're not going anywhere until we settle this. I came for instructions. I'm waiting to receive them. The old man trembled. But, my dear man, how am I to understand this? Cause and effect, I said crisply. My assignment, if you please. He paled, but was silent. I'm waiting. No answer. Why did you tell me about the millions of plans? Or perhaps I should ask, who told you to tell me? You don't feel like talking? Very well, I have time. I can wait. He only clasped his palsied hands together and lowered his head. What are you doing? I shouted and grabbed his arm. The face twisted in a hideous grimace and the eyes bulged in terror. He was sucking on the ring on his finger. There was a faint click, metal on metal, and I felt the rigid muscles turn to water. A second later, I was holding a corpse. I let it fall to the floor. The spectacles came off, and with them a fold of silver hair and baby pink skin, revealing a shock of jet black hair underneath. I stood there, the dead man at my feet, and listened to the pounding of my heart. I looked around frantically. I had to escape. Any moment now someone would come in and find me with the body of a man who had held some important post. Underdecoder? Eavesdropper? It didn't matter now. I made for the door, but stopped halfway. I couldn't possibly get through. They would recognize me for sure. And how would I explain? An alibi. I went back and lifted the body. The wig slid off. How much younger he looked in death. Carefully, I put the wig back on, fought down a wave of revulsion, gripped the body under the arms, and dragged it to the door. I could say he had a fainting spell. That would have to do. The office was empty. There were 2 doors. One led to the secretary's. The other probably led to the hall. I sat him in his chair behind the desk. He slumped. I tried to make him sit up. Impossible. The left arm dangled over the chair. I left the body as it was and ran out the second door. I didn't care what happened now. That's the end of chapter 2. And, I think it's a good place to stop for tonight. Hopefully you're enjoying it so far. At the very least, I'm pretty confident that it has revealed what type of book it is to you. So I'm not worried about that. Yeah, I think it's a lot of fun. And we will be here next week, same time, same place, to look at the green bathroom from The Shining some more. And we will start on chapter 3.